Welcome to the Time to Practice podcast and our summer of practice tips. If you've never listened to the podcast before, welcome. I'm so glad you're here. My name is Goodner. I'm a music educator, author, and podcaster who has made it my mission to talk about music practice and to support music educators and families looking to make home practice more effective and to help them also reduce conflict and frustration in the practice room. This episode is brought to you by my upcoming talk for families of music students called Setting Up for a Successful School Year in Music Lessons. And I'm going to be holding it in the afternoon at Pacific time on August 24th. Back to school is a great time to set intentions and routines for the year and remind ourselves of all the little things that can help support our child's music education for the year ahead. And we'll talk about that from various age range perspectives. I will have one rate for individual attendees and another rate for studios. So you can find information in the show notes of this episode or at suzukitriangle.com. Welcome back, everyone. This week, we are continuing in on our series on perfectionists and perfectionist thinking with an episode for teachers and music educators. Violinist and music educator Claire Allen joins us again for our second to last installment in this series, and she has come up with a list of great reflection questions for teachers that you can find in the show notes to refer to and reflect on after listening to this episode. We hope this episode gives you some good food for thought, sparks some good conversations with colleagues about how we all experience this in different ways, and helps us all feel seen and less alone. As always in this series, we want to remind you we are not trying to label anyone as perfectionist or not perfectionist. And we want to acknowledge as musicians that we have had striving for excellence and high standards as a goal around us, likely for a good portion of our lives. So that can be a wonderful thing for music making and also sometimes a challenging thing as human beings. So we're going to talk about some of that and also really be conscious to stay in our lanes as music educators and musicians who think about our own practice and teaching this way. But we are not mental health professionals, and none of what we say is meant to be mental health advice. Our goal is to better understand perfectionism, perfectionist thinking, and to discuss strategies for music learning and music practice that can help us as musicians, parents and caregivers, and especially today as teachers. All right, welcome back, everyone. We are excited to be here. Claire Allen is joining me again. We're in the middle of our series on perfectionism and perfectionist thinking in the music studio. And today is all about teachers who identify as perfectionists or maybe who saw themselves in some of the traits or the people-pleasing descriptions that we shared in earlier episodes. So we want to give you a few ideas to leave with today about your own teaching, and we hope you find this helpful, and would also love to hear from you if any of this strikes you or if you think of something else that's helped you, because I always get a lot out of talking about topics like this when people give feedback and say, oh, and also this thing. I feel like I always learn from you too. So please reach out and let us know what you would add. Claire, I'll pass it off to you to get us started.
Well, so I think everyone knows who I am by now. I've just invaded your podcast this summer. I'm Claire and I play and teach violin. And most relevant for this conversation, I consider myself a recovering perfectionist. And I think being a music teacher, as we've talked about, just being a musician in general, but being a music teacher specifically can be a really ripe environment for perfectionistic thinking and behaviors to come up, whether it's because of a particular work environment that we're in or the way that we're working with our students or from our own internal pressures. So I think that if you've been recognizing yourself in a lot of this and being like, well, wait, I need this, you're not alone. You know, we talked about the inner critic in the last episode, and it can be especially challenging when you're contending with your own inner critic and your student's inner critic in a lesson. So there's a lot going on. And of course, you know, I feel like becoming a teacher was actually one of the things that helped me really start to get a handle on my own perfectionism. Because when I started teaching, I was, you know, fresh out of conservatory, and which wonderful school, glad I went, would go again in a heartbeat. Well, if someone else paid for it. But definitely, you know, a place where you're in that state of high analysis and criticism of your playing at all times. And when I started teaching, I realized that there was such a difference between how I would talk to and support my students in the lessons and how I would talk to myself when I was practicing. And, slowly over the last decade or so, I've noticed that those two get closer together. You know, it's a lot more of, I can sense teacher Claire and I can sense, I mentioned whiny practice Claire earlier. And it's like, okay, I know. It's like, the meme, oh, I'm going on my stupid mental health walk. It's kind of like that. So it is a journey, and I think it's something that's definitely worth exploring for yourself because it is the type of thing that can really, really affect our students. And I am positive that there are times when I was in a more perfectionistic mindset and I didn't say things the right way to a student or, the way that they needed me to. And I'm sure that that showed up in lessons. I'm pretty confident that that's better now, but I know I'm not quote unquote perfect about it. So I think, spending time with yourself to explore how your brain works, how your approach, what your standards are for yourself, what your standards are for your students, if maybe there needs to be a difference between those, can be so helpful. So let's just talk through some of the different things, main ways that perfectionistic thinking can show up in teachers. And if you think of any others, Christine, please feel free to chime in. So one of mine was needing everything to be just right before teaching a student a new technique. So I'll give you the example of and string playing vibrato is a really big deal. And I know other instruments do vibrato too. Singers, woodwind and brass players, I think, I guess not pianists, sorry, pianists. But vibrato is this like incredibly weird, beautiful, hard thing that we do. And to develop it in violin playing, it takes literally months of exercises to even get your hands to do the thing, let alone sound the way you want it to. Because of how intricate the hand movements are, it can be incredibly easy to bring up lots of tension. So one of my things used to be, I will not teach vibrato until I've got a student's left hand frame set up correctly. Well, some kids just don't fix their left hand frame. And then the other thing I was running into is that if I didn't get to vibrato, their school teachers would get to vibrato and then they would be getting conflicting things. So that was something that I eventually had to let go of because, and ironically enough, a lot of vibrato exercises are also great at loosening up the left hand, and it actually helps them develop their left hand shape more. I mean, I'm not saying teach vibrato to your beginners. It's a personal decision where and how you decide to teach that. But, I found that I was being really rigid about until the left hand is, just so, I can't teach this other technique. But then it turned out that was actually really holding my students back and causing some issues for them at school. So that's something that I adjusted.
Right, right. And I think depending on who you do teacher training with, I've heard very different quote rules about when to do this or when to do that. And so that's also, I think, has helped me taking training from a number of different teacher trainers too to realize, okay, I can get really rigid about something because somebody told me early on in my teaching that I had to teach a certain way, and then somebody else has a totally opposite way. And it helped me give myself permission to do what was right for my students. And like you're saying, I think that's kind of just adaptive teaching. Much, we're not even talking about the perfectionism piece, but it's just like, what do our students need? And they do need us to have high standards.
Mm-hmm.
And I think also figure out a balance between what they need in the moment and how will we make all that work. That's complicated. So it's important to think about.
And I think related to that too, not allowing students to move on to something new until the previous thing is, and I quote, perfect, whatever that means to you. And, sometimes that might mean a student stays on a piece for months because there's some little detail, or every week the teacher's finding a different detail. Oh, no, this isn't good enough yet. Oh, this isn't good enough yet. So that might be another way that that's showing up.
I think also a few times a family has asked me because they didn't understand what I was looking for before they could quote pass off a piece or something that they've asked me can write down for them or give them guidance. What exactly are you looking for? And that actually, when I was a younger teacher, helped me to define for myself because what feels like quote perfect to me in my gut on a given day could be an unfair an unfair expectation if I don't have I'm looking for these things to be in place and what is reasonable to put on that list. And that helped me as a teacher to define that for myself because getting it perfect is not going to happen, but what is my standard? It's fair to have a standard, and also to realize if we have this, I always notice the gap, we may never be happy. And so how do we reconcile that?
Right. And that goes back to what we talked about back in the strategies for supporting students episode about being really clear in the assignments that you're giving.
Right.
So they don't ever feel like that they're just coming in and, oh, is she going to be in a good mood today? Will I get to pass this piece? And, context matters. If it's a piece that you want them to learn to get like to practice, like I sometimes give them little folk songs in different keys just because I want them to have more practice with a certain finger pattern. Like it's probably not going to be a recital piece. I want like if they can do the finger pattern, we're going to move off of it in a couple weeks. But if it's a piece where they have to play it for an audition, yeah, I'm gonna be a lot more pickier about it because I have to.
Sure.
Because in that situation, if I'm not picky about it, I'm doing them a disservice. So I think just context matters, and there's a balance between motivation for high standards and motivation from like feeling like you're accomplishing something. Self blame can come up a lot with perfectionistic thinking in teachers. So blaming yourself for your student outcomes. So for example, oh, that student had a really rough recital performance. That must have been all my fault. Or that student didn't get into that orchestra, or that student really isn't practicing. I'm not, I think we can have this myth of like the perfect inspirational, music teacher. Like we're all going to be Meryl Streep in Music of the Heart or something. You know, having a healthy balance of this is what I'm doing and I am providing the information and the support and the resources, but ultimately they're their own people and they have to make their own choices and face the consequences of those, choices. So we can't, it's not all on us. A lot of it is, but not all of it. And then on the flip side, or related to that, I should say, blaming yourself for behaviors of parents or family members who are supporting students in your studio. If they're showing up late or, always sending you emails like asking like lots of stuff, you might think like, oh gosh, was I not clear enough in what I was saying? So kind of blaming yourself for maybe behaviors that you're seeing in the adults in your studio that are not necessarily what you want.
Yeah, and I think we need to reflect and think about is there something I should be doing differently? And that's fair.
Right.
But it's that maladaptive perfectionism of now I'm going to beat myself up or decide I'm a failure, or those Muppet hecklers in the stands are gonna tell me all my flaws and repeat them over and over in my head as I'm trying to resolve this issue with the family. Like that's one of those things we want to watch out for because that can drain our energy and burn us out real fast. It's one thing to be like, I wasn't very clear. Let me resend an email to everybody and clarify, and then I'm going to let it go. And it's another thing to like really carry that around and beat ourselves up.
And that people pleasing is coming back here and related to it. Just feeling like like if you feel like a bad person, if a student or a parent or their caregiver is upset with you, I don't usually define myself as a people pleaser. We've talked about this. If anyone out there is like an Enneagram person, I define myself as a 1. So I want things to be right just because I want them to be right. And well, what does right mean? That's something I struggle to define. So if I'm right, I don't always necessarily care if people are happy with me sometimes, which I'm working on. Uh, but I definitely, especially early on in my teaching career, I can still vividly remember there were some emails I got from parents, and it was just like broke down crying, because it just felt like such a personal attack and an invalidation. And of course, they were coming from a place of wanting to understand and wanting to present their child's point of view and advocate for their child, which of course they have every right to do. The ways in which it was presented sometimes really, I took very personally. And that was a lot to learn how to like work through and, manage that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think somebody who definitely sees themselves in the people pleasing front too. I think we've been talking about asking students to play at a high standard and what is reasonable to keep moving forward and keep refining. But I think also there's a people pleasing. I think when I was a young teacher of like, well, I don't want to push them too hard because then the student might cry or they might feel like I was too whatever. And I think there's also this to be a good teacher. I also had to learn to set aside. Someone may feel like, well, that was really they're expecting a lot of us, and they can rise to that or not. But I also do my students a disservice if I just try to make them happy, but don't teach them to the best of my ability in an effort to avoid not pleasing them.
Right. And I think where I see this come up a lot in teacher discussion groups is the topic of makeup lessons and rescheduling, which that can really be where this people pleasing comes out, because genuinely, most families I know have a lot going on and often need flexibility. And I would just say that in terms of, if there's teachers out there listening, which hopefully you are, since this is an episode about teachers, to have a policy that feels fair to you and that you communicate that policy as clearly as possible as you can upfront when people join the studio. I have this whole thing where I make them do a DocuSign every single clause of my makeup policy, because I don't have room in my schedule to give everyone makeups. And I really believe in fairness to my studio. And it's like, well, how do you decide that this person gets one and this other person doesn't get one? And it only counts if this happens. And so, I offer a range of options, but I know that that doesn't work for every family. So I try to be really upfront when people are joining my studio that this is not a cancel when you want and reschedule situation. And teachers who have more flexibility in their schedule and can do that, may still want to be very clear about the parameters in which they're offering them. So I say, being deciding what works for you and then being clear and fair about it.
Sure. Right. Right. And it's, someone with this tendency like I have might always just feel like, oh, I wish I could make everyone happy. And also I cannot, sadly. So
Right.
it can cause a lot of stress. I think the reason we're talking about it is just because these are things that can cause us a lot of stress as a teacher, or could, cause stress to our students in other cases of things we're talking about. And it's important to think through them and, decide what we want to work on our own.
Yeah. And I put this on here just kind of as like a little joke at the conference, but I said, thinking that you can single-handedly reshape someone's perfectionistic responses through music lessons alone, or in one conference presentation, or in a podcast series. So, I definitely, at some point while we were prepping all of this, was like, oh yeah, this is going to help so many people. We're going to like cure perfectionism. And I was like, no, that's not the point.
Right.
It's about giving tools. So just if you've been listening to this and you're like, oh yeah, I'm gonna do it, just yes, awesome, like excited to hear how it works for you, but also go easy on yourself.
Right. Right. I think it's a lot of what we talked about with maladaptive perfectionism is it has an element of wanting to control outcomes that's woven in. And so we can feel like, well, I will control how my students are, developing as perfectionists or not by everything I do. And we just ultimately don't have that much control over what we're doing. But the strategies are important and the self awareness is important. And again, this is a really long game, all of this. And so it's easy to feel frustrated if we try to decide we can control it all.
Yeah, I know something that was really tough for me. I mentioned, coming out of conservatory, which is in a highly intense, really serious environment where everyone wants to be a professional musician and everyone is practicing to become a professional musician, and they take things their teachers say seriously. Like if my teacher said, oh, doing your left hand like this for 6 hours a day is going to hurt you, you have to change it to this, I was like, oh my gosh, I've like destroyed my life by doing it the other way, let me like fix it right away. And unless you are teaching in a conservatory or a very serious pre-college environment, it's highly likely that most, if not all of your students are not going to be on that track, which is totally fine. So I think it's worth thinking about what is the role that music plays in your students' lives. I never want to put limitations on my expectations for students. And I always say, I'm always open to surprises. But let's say, a student who started later, and by later, I'm going to say, let's say they started in late elementary school and they've played in school orchestra for a few years, and I get them at the end of middle school or in early high school. I know I have like 3 or 4 years with them. Am I going to be teaching this person Tchaikovsky concerto their senior year of high school? Probably not. Open to being surprised, but probably not. So just kind of being realistic and like, their goal is probably to get better at what they're doing and to be able to participate successfully in their high school orchestras, and they're not going to go to music school or music college. And I think that's fine. So I don't need to train them like they're going to a conservatory. So I think sometimes, a lot of us teach like we were taught, which if we're just at a music school was pretty intensely. So what I think is important is finding like deal breakers and like saying, okay, so for me, I'm a maniac about stance and body awareness and like how that instrument is supported for violinists. So I'm hopefully, if you come to my studio recitals, you'll see that reflected. But, that's for me, that's a deal breaker. And by deal breaker, I mean in a lesson, if that violin goes up and it droops, I'm going to fix that before we go on. Other things, I said the left hand thing earlier, I might let that go longer as long as it's like working for them. And again, there's not like a long term goal that that's going to hinder. So yeah, I think for every teacher, just kind of deciding like what are your deal breakers? Like what do you have to have in your students? Or as my teacher trainer, my most recent teacher trainer said, what drives you crazy? What are you not going to be able to sit there and live with? And then what are some other things where it's, well, it'd be nice if they were doing 5 different etudes in every single technique per week, but that's not really reasonable. So what's the most important to me?
Yeah. No, I think that is really, really helpful because, and we've talked about this as we were preparing and doing our research, is this when we're in an environment where our whole world is music, we just have a certain outlook that maybe for some of our students, it's one aspect of their life. And it might mean a lot to them, but it may not be as all encompassing as it is for us. And I think the level of respect for just where does music fit in the student's life, and also not making ourselves really stressed out because we feel like, oh, well, I'm feeling them because they're not on this other particular track. I think that's helpful to think through.
Right. And the idea that, especially if we're teaching full time, it is a very significant portion of our lives.
Right.
And for our students, it's a very small part of theirs for most of them. For us, we're teaching, multiple hours, multiple days per week, and they're coming what for an hour. So I think just having that perspective, like what else is going on with them and, getting to know them and realizing that it can help take the pressure off.
Right. And we're not talking, as you said, about not teaching with excellence or not expecting good technique or anything like that. We're just kind of framing for ourselves how we approach our teaching.
Right. So, and then the other thing I had, come up with for our presentation was just some reflection questions for teachers, which are going to be different for everyone. The answers. There's so many ways to teach music well, is what I always tell people. I also tell people that, my students, if you go on the internet, you can find someone teaching everything that I teach the exact opposite way and telling you that what I do is wrong. There's so many people out there with courses and YouTube channels. And I mean, some of it probably is objectively wrong if you're looking at it from a, correct playing standpoint, but, finding like what works for you. So, like, the first question I think to think about is what is my personal definition of a successful student? And is it someone who starts really little and practices all the way through and is playing, major concertos by the time they're in high school and is possible to perform in competitions and could take conservatory auditions if they wanted to? And that's perfectly valid if that's what you do. I know teachers like that and they're very successful with what works for them. For me, I've come around to it's a student who is willing to do the work to get to know themselves with me and the lesson, to become aware of themselves, who is willing to do the work on technique at whatever that level is, and who gets to a point where their goals match their reality. And, so as long as the expectation and the effort is like matching, I'm totally happy. And whether that's, I want to learn Suzuki Book 1 in high school because I've always wanted to play violin and I didn't get to when I was little. That's great. As long as they're putting in the work in and coming to lessons and interacting with me. And if that's, I want to, get in this top orchestra and go to music school and play a concerto in a competition, like, yeah, I can do that too. I'm going to teach those two kids totally differently. But I think just defining like what success means in your studio is really helpful.
Yeah. And I think for a lot of us as teachers, people can identify with the idea that what's put out as success as a teacher is like, oh, how your student got into college as a music major, or your student kept playing through high school, or your student achieved a certain level. And that's all fabulous. And we can probably all agree that's a big success, but not a lot of us are teaching students that are future doctors and engineers and teachers, and music is going to be a really important part of their life, but maybe not the only thing they're doing or their main focus. And how do we define success, for all students, and not feel like, oh, well, I feel self-conscious because my studio has a lot of those students where this is their, not going to be their major in college, for example.
Right. Well, I also like to think I'm hopefully teaching future concert goers, future subscribers to concert series packages, future donors to arts organizations, maybe even future board members. I think, and I talked to my high schoolers about that. We need people who are not professional musicians, but who might have that leadership opportunity, who like know how a violin works when they're in that boardroom, you know?
Yes, yes. Same for any instrument, of course. And then
Yeah.
also just, I think just humans who have learned, how do I work with myself? How do I lead and also, follow or be part of a team and a community? There's so many life lessons and um, life skills that we've talked about in previous episodes, even of this series, that I feel like, okay, if my students leave, and number one, they feel like music gave them something in their life and they leave with some of these life skills that, they sort of developed from our time together. I always define that as a success
Mm-hmm.
as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So, kind of related to what we were saying earlier, like another thing to think about is when is a piece done? Because you could argue that a piece is never done. And as professionals, we know that if we're playing in an orchestra or recital program or something, uh, you might play something that you've played before. So right now I'm working on a string quartet that I learned for the first time like back in college. That in fact was like one of the first things I played on my violin when I bought my violin. And now it's, years later and I'm playing it, much, much at a different level, let's just say. So, but for the sake of teaching, like what are the things like we talked about that you need to hear before you can say, we're going to stop working on this for a while. And being clear about that for yourself and communicating that clearly to your student. That's another area where I've previously have encountered kind of some tension in students and parents is like, oh, when are we going to be done with this? Or when are we going to finish the book or get the new piece or all of that? And sometimes it is a matter of, kids learning like, no, we don't get everything instantly. Things take time. And sometimes it is, I am being kind of picky about that. And I could probably get this technique in like the next piece or in a scale or in review or something. So we probably can do something new. And related to that, the idea of performance ready, what does that mean? Because I feel that so many teachers do performances so differently in their studio. And I think it also depends on style of playing and it depends on instrument. For some people, memory is a non negotiable. A recital piece has to be memorized. And for some people, it's not a big deal. Some people might do recitals and you have to, be memorized and with piano. That's me. Uh, but some people might say it doesn't have to be memorized and it doesn't have to be with piano if you're doing a more casual recital. And that's fine too, but just kind of defining that.
And I think having definitions for ourselves helps us not get into the negative thought patterns. We can kind of rest on that thought, or have the more adaptive feeling about things, or have the two thoughts. I wish this was a little more polished, but also it falls into what I just define as a performance ready. So we're good for now.
Right. And I could probably do an entire podcast on this topic, but I'll just mention it briefly. Thinking as a teacher, especially a private teacher, about how you set up and create performance experiences in your studio. And I recently, over the last couple of years, have had the opportunity to rethink a lot of how I do things because I was teaching at a school and now I'm teaching independently. So some things that I changed in my studio to help my students feel more comfortable. So I send them the program a week in advance so they know what order there is. So there's no more coming in the day of the recital and being like, what order am I? I also don't do the order based on age and I don't do it based on level. So sometimes people are like this, oh, if I'm at this point in the program, that means this person's better and whatever. I don't do any of that. And I deliberately try to mix up who goes first and last every single time. I always try to include group pieces so that we're together. I have a dress rehearsal in the space where we're going to perform. So they're not going to anywhere unusual and they're used to the acoustic. And I also have the pianist come in not only for our dress rehearsal, but to be available for individual rehearsals that they can do if they want. Because it used to be they got one quick rehearsal, not in the space, and they didn't know what order they were. And there were just so many elements of uncertainty that had nothing to do with their performance preparation. So I've really kind of looked at what are the things that I can control in the environment that might make performance a little bit more comfortable of a thing. I've talked to so many people over the years who said, I took piano lessons as a kid, but I just hated playing in recitals. It was just, such a horrible performance experience. So I think teaching performance as a skill and then crafting a performance environment that helps support our kids, because especially for our more perfectionistic students, I mean, that's like public performance is like the perfectionist Olympics here. All those voices are going to be going in their head if they've got them.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that's some really good thoughts on performing. I'm glad you get to design your own performance routines now. That's great.
Yeah, it's fun. I mean, and it's not to say that they're not nervous, but I would say that they're more used to being nervous and that some of them might be a little less nervous. I don't want to speak for them if my students are listening to this. Your feelings are valid and they are yours. So, and if you have ideas for how I can make our performances even more comfortable for you, please let me know. Using your music is not one of those at this time. But and part of that performance prep is just getting them used to playing through things in the lesson. So we talked about, earlier, how often do you stop a student when they're playing? Because someone who might be hypersensitive to criticism, um, I realized I was doing this. I've always let them play through, but some of them, I think the more people pleasers who are more hyper attuned to me, it's like if I move in a certain way or move my head in a lesson, they're like, what did I do wrong? And I'm like, I had an itch. I'm okay. But so getting them used to being able to play through things without you reacting to it, I think is another important step toward performance prep.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. So for those of you listening, we're kind of like circling back to our reflection questions, and that is one that Claire's proposing is how, when, and why do we stop a student when they're playing? Um, so I just wanted to make that clear for you listening because we've gone off on a little tangent, but we're
Yeah.
bringing it back here.
Sorry.
No, you're good. I just want to make sure people are following us. So that is a really interesting question to ask ourselves as a teacher. And it could be vary from student to student and from, a student at a certain age versus another age, but giving ourselves a little bit of reflection on when you're going to do that and how it affects a particular student can be really beneficial. So we're thinking about.
Yeah, something that my teacher does that I find really effective is she'll have me play through a section because I'm playing like really big long pieces, so it would just take forever to play through it. So she'll say, let's play through this section," and I'll play through it, and then she'll say, "Okay, go back to the beginning," and then this time I'm going to stop you and talk about stuff. So I get the chance to play it for her and show her what I've done. But then she also says, "Okay, now I'm going to go back and stop you." So like I know that I play something, and I'm like expecting her to stop me, and I'm in that more analytical stage, and it doesn't bother me.
Yeah, I think that's something to think about too, is just letting the student know or your child know if you're given the task from your teacher to be part of the practice process is this time you're just going to play, or this time I'm going to interrupt you and we're going to work out.
Yeah. And you could do it the other way. You could have them go through and be really picky about it. And then I'll say, let's see how much of that sink in. I'm going to sit here, cover my mouth, not say anything. You're going to play and see how it goes.
Yeah, sometimes I like that approach. Just if I know there's a lot of spots, we'll tackle those first and then do a run through. So yes, both work. I love that.
And both work with the same student on different days. And like we've said, it just depends.
Right.
A couple more questions just for teachers to kind of think about as they're assessing their own perfectionistic tendencies. How do I react when a parent gives me feedback? Like you heard me talk about, I reacted not well earlier. I would like to think that I've gotten to a much healthier place and I've gotten some really fabulous feedback from parents over the years, like the new recital setup. They've look, this is so much better. This is so much more comfortable for our students. They're sounding better. They're more comfortable. So that's really great to hear. I've had them make good suggestions about things. Usually my answer is let me think about that and I'll see if that's going to work for everyone. But yeah, how do you react when you get that email or that parent says, hey, could we do this? Or hey, we're concerned that progress isn't going as well as we wanted it to be.
No, that's an issue for me because of the people pleasing. I do
Mm,
realize that about myself because I'm always wanting everybody to be happy. So if somebody is even, I don't know, it can be like not about me at all, but then I'm like, oh no, I did something wrong, which is just my, gut reaction to things. So I have realized that I can be sensitive. I think just knowing that about myself, that I can be sensitive and take things too personally when somebody's just, hey, my kid is having a hard time with this. It might not be about me at all. So I have learned to not respond right away if I feel like something gives me strong feelings about things. Cause then my tendency, before I was more aware about this, I would just like to send a defensive, email back or like defending myself. And sometimes it wasn't even you interpreted that differently than the parent meant even. So I have learned to just put a lot of space around feedback that might make me feel
mm-hmm.
self-conscious about that I make someone unhappy, or I want to make this person happy and actually I cannot because they want me to teach them at 9 o'clock at night, or they need a time that I've already given to somebody else, or just there's sometimes we just can't make everybody happy. So I know that's an issue for myself, and I have to just notice, okay, I can see this is making me feel sensitive, that I can't make them happy, and I have learned to give that some space before I respond. That's my responsibility to work through because I'm offering a service of lessons. And then it's either I can accommodate you or I can't. And I want to respond in that kind of way. So I have to give myself some
Yeah.
space and work through the stuff that's my stuff And
Right. Yeah, I've learned that the email that you need to write and the email you need to send are two different emails. So I will sometimes write the email that I personally need to write, and then I will sit on it overnight and I'm try to not even put an address in the address bar so it can't get sent accidentally. I also have a delay on my email, so if I hit send accidentally, I can undo it. And then I usually talk to, my husband or a teacher friend or someone to get perspective. So, we've texted each other over the years about things.
yes, yes.
And then I come back and I'm like, okay, what does this parent need from me? Here's the relevant information.
Yeah. And we have, it's a tricky job to do what we do. Unlike school teachers, we might work with a student for 5, 10 plus years. And
Mm-hmm.
there's a close relationship, and there's a relationship piece, and there's a business piece, and here's the logistics piece. And it's hard for that not to get tangled up or not to get our personal feelings in the mix.
Right, for
And so
sure.
it is a good reason to be reflective and to have people that hopefully we can bounce things off each other and talk each other down and think about how do we best serve our students and also how do we best take care of ourselves so we don't burn out and all those things. It's a balance.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and then kind of the last thing on the topic of feedback that can be great for teachers to think about is, do I actively avoid situations or I might get feedback on my teaching? So do I offer a parent conference opportunity in my studio or student surveys, or do I avoid having my students play for other teachers or in places where they might get adjudication or feedback and things like that? So, and you just did a whole thing on parent conferences. So, and I did them for the first year in a more formal way in my studio this year. And I had some great conversations with parents, and it's just kind of amazing to see, oh, we had a lovely conversation, but I could totally see how if I hadn't done this in 6 months to a year, this little thing that we talked about totally could have snowballed in some way if the circumstances were
Yes.
right. So it was
I
great.
think it's so important. And I put off once I got the idea, like I should do this a number of years ago. I put it off a couple of years just because I was afraid people would tell me bad things or complain about me or something. And that's really not how it goes. Like sometimes people are like, oh, we could use more support with this. But I would say 90+% of the time, it's all very positive. And my I don't want to get feedback was getting in the way of something that I think, like you're saying, Claire, it just helps us have conversations when we need them because we've opened up this line of communication and parents and families know the teacher cares about my student. They think about my student when they're not teaching. People may not realize that. And it helps head off some problems when they're just barely sprouting so they don't become a big thing getting in our way. And I know for myself, I bring in a clinician and do a workshop with my students every year. And every year I get very stressed out beforehand, even though it always goes great. And my students are always well prepared because I am very diligent about making sure we're not going to play something that's not prepared. But it does stress me out. Oh, it's vulnerable. I'm putting myself out here. I want everyone to say, my teaching's amazing and my vulnerabilities will all be on display. But I do it because despite my uncomfortableness, I see how it helps my students grow. I see this, growth in a weekend because they're all watching each other and they're all taking in this ideas from somebody who's just saying it a little different than me, maybe, or has a new way of putting something. And it's so good for my students. And so I do have to reflect every year when I'm like, here comes the stress again for myself as the people pleaser, but this is really good. And I see it as there and it hasn't magically gone away
Mm,
because I'm aware of this, but I have learned to make peace with the fact that, okay, I'm going to feel this way. And afterwards, I'm going to feel so glad I did this. And yes, it's uncomfortable. And also, it always goes fine. And I just have to,
right.
bring in people I know will work well with my students. And so I can really empathize with anybody who feels like when we ask this question of do I avoid these situations? Ooh, I do. Like I am there with you. I totally avoid those situations, or I want to. And I have learned, after a couple of decades of teaching, I might be careful what I pick so that I know it's a healthy environment. But I think that's good anyway. And then I don't avoid it because I see how valuable it is, and it's an ongoing reflection for me.
Sometimes if I do the mental gymnastics just right, I can get my perfectionism to push me into doing stuff like that. Uh,
Right?
like in my last few Suzuki training sessions I did, we had the opportunity to submit a teaching video that, the entire class would watch and then talk about. So I had to video myself teaching, and then I had to watch the video of myself teaching, and then I had to have my class and my teacher trainer talk about my teaching.
So
And
vulnerable, right?
oh, I just like had cringe every time. If I watch videos of myself playing or teaching, I have to have, chocolate nearby and a fuzzy like security blanket. And and of course it was fine, and my teacher trainer was able to very kindly point out some things that were great points of reflection for me as a teacher. And the next course when I submitted the same, a video again, he was like, "Oh, these are the ways that you've grown." And I was like, "Oh, okay." So yeah, so if I'm like, "Oh, wait, but to be a better teacher, I should do this." So sometimes I can lever that perfectionism into a growth place.
Yeah. I think it's really important to think about as teachers. And I do want to thank Claire for kind of putting these reflection questions together. And I think if you're okay with it, Claire, maybe we can just put them into a PDF, make it available with the
Yeah,
show
of
notes
course.
for this so that teachers could just take that for themselves and reflect on that in their own teaching. We'd love to encourage you to do that. And we know how valuable that is. And also, there's a lot of vulnerability in thinking about these things for ourselves, but that's how we grow as teachers.
Especially because as teachers, we're supposed to have the answers, right? So it can be vulnerable to say, "Oh, I'm not sure," to a student, or "I don't know, let's try this and see if it works. It might not," or "Let me do some research and get back to you." I've tried to get myself comfortable with those things, and I try to not come off as completely omnipotent to my students, because that's real dangerous.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that's a good point to kind of wrap up our segment on teachers. Teachers, if you're listening, we know this is a tip of an iceberg conversation that Claire and I have just had, but we hope it's given you some food for thought and some maybe spark some conversations with other colleagues. You could send this particular episode to your teacher friends or your local association and be like, let's talk about this as a group, because we hope it sparks lots of conversation. Because I know it's helped Claire and I to have these conversations with each other and with other teachers that we're connected with. It helps all of us kind of face our vulnerability and think about what we're doing, whether or not we fall in this perfectionism category. We can probably see some things that would benefit us in this conversation.
And also just the fact that you have listened all the way through to this episode. If you're hearing this part, that already means you're a great teacher who is willing to do that hard work of reflection. And your students are so lucky to have you. I don't need to know who you are or like what you're doing. Like, if you're the type of person who's listening to this and self-reflecting even a little bit, that's awesome.
Exactly. Exactly. So hats off to all of you. Big thank you to teachers who work with students all over the country and world who are supporting their students and taking care of themselves along the way. If you're a parent or caregiver listening to this, give your teacher a big thank you, however you can. And thank you for thinking maybe about how your teacher approaches this from their
Mm-hmm.
perspective. We care about our students so much. And I know we stay up at night and ask our colleagues for help as we're thinking about how do I support each student in my studio and help them, achieve what they can and with their support. So it was fun to do an episode just for teachers today. And we are going to come back with one more episode about perfectionism for you in this series for parents and caregivers who are supporting their students in home practice. And we will see you next week for that. Thanks for joining us.
Bye.
Before we go today, I want to thank Claire Allen again for her list of reflection questions, which you can find in the show notes of this episode. They are great food for thought, and this is, only two people having this conversation today who identify as perfectionists, talking about our own experiences. We know everyone is unique, and you may or may not struggle with some of these same ideas in the same way that we do. But that's why those questions can be really helpful for you to dig into, how all of this affects you. It could also be a great list of questions to work through with a coach or a trained therapist. So we can't wait to hear what you learn about yourself when you dig into them. Please reach out to us, and we would love to connect with you about that. We will be back next week with our final episode in this series on perfectionism by sharing an episode for families of music students and some ideas of teachers can use to support the families in their studios woven in as well. So we can't wait to have you join us next week. We'd love to hear from you. You can send me an email or a message through Instagram. Connecting with listeners is one of my favorite things. It helps me stay motivated and know what's connecting with the audience. So it's one of my favorite parts of doing this podcast. If you'd like to join me for my online session, Setting Up for a Successful School Year on Sunday, August 24th, either live or by receiving the recording, you can do that at suzukitriangle.com. Until next week, I wish you all a great week of practicing. Take good care.